Hello, my fellow ANCOM trannies. Today we are talking about the best, most wholesome anarchist chungus that ever lived. Benito Mussolini.
I am an anti-Christ. I am an anarchist. Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it.
When I say that fascism is not only rooted in anarchism, but the direct continuation of Proudhonian anarchism through revolutionary syndicalism, then national syndicalism, and then finally into fascism and the universal third position, that is definitely going to be a controversial take.
Hey man, what is this anarchist syndicalism doing in my base traditional Catholic fascismo? Tu as come Jew or something, pendejo?
Oui, we are for the Catholic monarchy. Vive la roi! Vive Jesus Christ!
We're here for the Catholic monarchy, right, sir? Do you believe in the Catholic monarchy?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, amen! God bless you, brother. So we're here. This is the march for the monarchy because there's thousands of people who support the restoration of the monarchy.
Do Goyim really? 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 Do Goyim really?
You will be turned into rocket fuel for the space fleet of the futurist world syndical imperium. In order to get to Mussolini, we first have to start with Pierre Joseph Proudhon. For a brief exposition of what Proudhonian anarchism actually is, you can watch my video, What Did Proudhon Mean by Anarchy? So, to sum this all up, the anarchist state for Proudhon is not this gay alliance of gardening communes. No, it is a highly effective industrial political apparatus called agro-industrial federation, where the division of powers and sweeping local autonomy is meant to resemble the workings of antinomic forces balanced in such a way as to construct a perfect order or rhythm of society. Proudhon doesn't want to get rid of the state as some kind of individualistic and libidinal rebellion against order, work, and beauty. He wants to get rid of the state so that the producers can hold the whip, which will direct society into a perfect industrial machine that coordinates life, production, war, and peace. Proudhon, while being an anarchist, is surprisingly obsessed with order. So anarchism for Proudhon is a scientific industrial republic organized federally from autonomous producer associations, or what we'd call them syndicates, self-governing municipal communes, and a giant socialist people's bank. We can compare this ideal to what fascism was in practice, and we will see that it is very close to the Proudhonian ideal, but I'll leave that for later in the video. What I want to explore first is how Proudhon shaped fascist ideology. Reliance was also placed on human kindness and other sentiments of humanity, of brotherhood and love, which ought, it was maintained, to bind all the different branches of the species man together, regardless of barriers of land or sea. Another illusion. It is very true that these feelings of sympathy and brotherliness exist. Our century has, in truth, seen the rapid multiplication of philanthropic works for the alleviation of the hardships both of men and of animals. But along with these impulses exist others, profounder, higher, and more vital. We should not explain the universal phenomenon of war by attributing it to the caprices of monarchs, race hatred, or economic rivalry. We must take into account other feelings which each of us carries in his heart, and which made Proudhon exclaim with that perennial truth which hides beneath the mask of paradox that war was of divine origin. This quote is from Mussolini's 1914 speech in Parma, which he made in support of the cause of intervention against the Axis powers in World War I. He makes a direct reference to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon here, specifically his book War and Peace, which directly inspired the novel of the same name by Leo Tolstoy. I am about a third of the way done with War and Peace, and the basic gist of the book is that war is the force in humanity which calls upon man's higher virtues and the wellspring for all jurisprudence. As Edward Berth would later say quite explicitly, war is the first thing that called humanity out of idle laziness.
Friends, I love war. I love holocausts. I love blitzkriegs. I love defensive lines. I love sieges, charges. I love mop-up operations and retreats.
Initially, in all peoples, war appears as a divine fact. By divine, I mean everything in nature that is directly derived from creative power, or, in man, from spontaneity of mind or conscience. In other words, I mean by divine everything which, breaking the mold or serving as the initiation of a brand new mold, admits neither question or doubt on the part of the philosopher. The divine imposes itself by sheer force, it does not respond to questions posed to it, and is indifferent to proof. So, the divinity of war for anarchism and later fascism refers to it as a creative force. War here is not understood merely as a force of rejuvenation or social hygiene, rather it presents man with an internal, progressive development capable of realizing concepts of justice that are imminent in human history. War is the method by which man escapes the void of peace for the realization of what we know as justice. In humanity, war, like religion and justice, is more of an internal than an external phenomenon, a feature of moral life rather than of the life of the body and the emotions. Which is why war, forever judged by the common man and the philosophers by its appearances, has never been understood, except perhaps in the times of the heroes. Yet everything in our nature supposes it and its presence, as well as the notion, is implicit in everything. War is godly, which is to say primordial, essential to life, to the very production of man and society. It has its home in the depths of consciousness, and the idea encompasses the universality of human relationships. Through it are revealed and expressed, from earliest times, our highest faculties: religion, justice, poetry, the fine arts, social economics, politics, government, nobility, bourgeoisie, royalty, ownership. Through it, down through the succeeding ages, Moors drew refreshment, nations regeneration, states balanced, progress pursued, justice established its empire, freedom found its guarantees. Let us suppose that the notion of war is done away with. Nothing is left standing of the human race's past or present. What society might have become in its absence is unthinkable. There is no telling what it may yet become. Civilization tumbles into the void. Its previous movement is a myth unmatched by any reality, its subsequent development an unknown, fathomable by no philosophy. Peace itself, ultimately, in the absence of war, defies understanding. It has nothing positive or true about it. It is bereft of value and import. It is nothingness. Yet, mankind wages war and strives with all its might for peace. Basic facts in society's authentic aspirations are at loggerheads. The problem thus posed is the object of these inquiries. So, War is understood as this primordial force driving the advance of civilization. War is a basic fact of human society, and our aspirations for peace cannot overcome war by a pure negation and pacification. At this time, Kantian doctrines of perpetual peace were all the rage in the decadent bourgeois world. Proudhon rejected this in his time, just as Mussolini would. First of all, as regards the future development of mankind, and quite apart from all present political considerations, fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. It therefore discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly, supine renunciation in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. War alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those peoples who have the courage to face it. All other tests are substitutes which never place a man face to face with himself before the alternative of life or death. Therefore, all doctrines which postulate peace at all costs are incompatible with fascism. Equally foreign to the spirit of fascism, even if accepted as useful in meeting special political situations, are all internationalistic or league superstructures which, as history shows, crumble to the ground whenever the heart of nations is deeply stirred by sentimental, idealistic, or practical considerations. Fascism carries this anti-pacifistic attitude into the life of the individual. I don't care a damn. Me ne frego. The proud motto of the fighting squads, scrawled by a wounded man on his bandages, is not only an act of philosophic stoicism, it also sums up a doctrine which is not merely political. It is evidence of a fighting spirit which accepts all risks. It signifies a new style of Italian life. The fascist accepts and loves life. He rejects and despises suicide as cowardly. Life, as he understands it, it means duty, elevation, conquest. Life must be lofty and full. It must be lived for oneself, but above all for others, both nearby and far off, present and future. So, we understand that both anarchism and fascism are both anti-pacifist at their core. But what does this really mean? No revolutionary doctrine can call itself revolutionary if it simply accepts the world for what it is, with no aspiration for change, just as, on the other hand, a doctrine cannot be revolutionary if it wishes to change the world by the pacification of vital impulses and passions. Both the concepts of perpetual brutal warfare and pacification for perpetual peace are reactionary. What is to be sought is a change that transforms war into something higher and more vital rather than accepting it as an immutable fact or wanting to stamp it out by some imagined peaceful means. What have I said? I would snap my pen in two before I would breathe any discord into peaceful populations. I warn my readers, I too shall conclude by opposing the warmongering status quo, opposing the institutions of militarism, opposing its poetry, opposing its mores. But the fact is that I believe not in the abolition, but rather in the transformation of war, and by that alone to a complete renovation of humanity's circumstances in everything relating to religion, ideas, rights, politics, arts, work, family, and urban relations. But for my heartfelt belief in the revolution, I would refrain, as I would from blasphemy, from uttering a word against war. I would regard the devotees of perpetual peace as the most despicable of hypocrites, the scourge of civilization, and a blight upon societies. So, what Proudhon despises in the Kantian pacifists of his age was not that they wanted to bar him from playing total war in real life, which is a real noble aspiration, by the way. No, he actually regards the advocates of perpetual peace as the most despicable of hypocrites, who debase war and in the end uphold militarism. For Proudhon, it was the transformation of war from militarism into economics and production that would end the brutality of war. For Proudhon's ultimate vision, imagine a world of these scientific industrial republics in a state of eternal war, not through soldiers on the battlefield, but instead producer associations wielding industry according to an internal discipline of collective struggle. In their great battles, what would be left behind is not piles of corpses and scorched fields, but rather canals, railways, bridges, ports, and prosperity. The socialism of war wishes for you to be a free, self-actualizing man engaged in vital collectivity. The socialism of peace wants you to be a pacified slave. Mussolini expresses very similar notions on the hypocrisy of perpetual peace in his speech delivered in Milan on the 22nd of July, where he outlines the aims and program of fascism. I am not afraid of the word. I am a revolutionary and a reactionary. Really, life is always like this. I am afraid of the revolution which destroys and does not create. I fear going to extremes, the policy of madness, at the bottom of which may lie the destruction of this, our fragile mechanical civilization, robbed of its solid moral basis, and the coming of a terrible race of dominators who would reintroduce discipline into the world and reestablish the necessary hierarchies with the cracking of whips and machine guns. Okay, so we can clearly see that fascism upholds war as a principle of life and not some notion that war is to be upheld for the sake of war. Mussolini and Proudhon both regard the advocates of perpetual peace as the worst of hypocrites who will bring about the opposite of what they espouse. And today, we can see that they are correct. The peace-mongering imperialists of the West have utterly destroyed nations in the name of their vision of world peace. Now, this brings us to what is that thing that drove the nationalists and the revolutionary syndicalists into their synthesis in achieving fascism. It was their anti-pacifism. That is, not that they both thought violence was really cool, but that for a revolution to bring freedom, it must work with what actually exists in the world and not the fantasies in the minds of men. This brings us to the nationalism of Enrico Corradini that would merge with the Italian syndicalists, and in turn, the revolutionary syndicalism of that age would merge with the nationalism of Enrico Corradini. What they sought and accepted mutually was the imperative question of getting out of Italy's laggard development. This meant the nationalists had to sacrifice their sentimentalism for the Italy of the barons and princes and feudal bullshit, while the syndicalists had to accept some compromise with the bourgeoisie. This is how national syndicalism came about. In the world at the beginning of the 20th century, Corradini maintained only nations could serve as international actors. The world, almost all nationalists argued, was an arena of Darwinian struggle for survival. If Italian workers expected to survive and prosper in such a world, they required entrepreneurs, functionaries, merchants, financiers, intellectuals, educators, and state officials. Once syndicalists understood that, Corradini concluded they could only become advocates and practitioners of a national syndicalism, a revolutionary syndicalism that nationalists could wholeheartedly support. Like most new nationalists and revolutionary syndicalists, Corradini anticipated the emergence of a revolutionary elite in Italy, an aristocracy of commitment and competence that would shepherd the nation from its status as an international inferior to that of a great power. The revolutionary syndicalists, like the nationalists, sought just such an elite in their own search for proletarian justice. Corradini maintained that the syndicalists fully understood the character of intact and vital communities. They understood that only the bonding of similars, united in a mission against opponents, might assure success in external conflict. Syndicalists, like nationalists, appreciated the fact that vital communities were invariably led by effective elites, an aristocracy of purpose, capable of transforming the psychology of the masses. More than that, syndicalists, like nationalists, sought justice in a world in which injustice was all but universal. The political aristocracy anticipated by the syndicalists was an aristocracy that would lead the working class movement to victory against a complacent and ineffectual ruling class. An effete ruling class no longer possessed of the qualities of leadership. Corradini argued that the syndicalists were essentially correct in their assessment of the Italian political scene. Italy required an elite of strength, competence, and courage. Such an elite was not to be found among the orthodox Marxists of the Italian Socialist Party. It was not to be found among the established Italian middle class. What was required was a new political class, an elite that would assume control of the peninsula through a rotation of elites. Such a rotation, anticipated by Vilfredo Pareto, would bring forward a small minority of persons committed to the creation of a new Italy, a class that understood accelerated productivity, anti-democratic strength in political leadership, and an aggressive pursuit of the nation's interests. It would be the aristocracy of an emergent Italy. It would be an aristocracy of heroic demeanor, cognizant of the fact that Italy's late development would require sacrifice, discipline, and enterprise of almost preternatural character. So, we understand that fascist and Proudhonian anarchist philosophy are so similar that we can't just understand one as taking some influence from the other, but rather, fascism is the logical development of Proudhonian anarchist socialism. Fascism, or rather national syndicalism, is basically a developmental regime to achieve the anarchist ideal. The Republic of Progress, Science, and Law, the Agro-Industrial Federation, the socialism of the freely associated producer. We will now assess the product of fascist statecraft with the anarchist ideal of Agro-Industrial Federation.
Più non risplende il denaro americano, il cancro sionista ormai minaccia invano, la mano dei sovietici non fa paura, la nostra nuova aurora sorge già sicura. Contro il potere terrorista dello Stato si erge il contropotere organizzato, l'unità di popolo spazzerà via l'usurato trono della borghesia.
Moonlight shining above the water, anyway there's tonight. Trees like the seas are lonely there, no weakness of the kite will open.
In theory, fascism has already given place to syndicalism, and in practice, the change is progressing rapidly. This fact still receives scant notice outside Italy, and even within Italy. The transformation is being engineered so skillfully as to be almost imperceptible to the layman. The word fascism is, of course, more universal than ever, but its meaning has undergone a radical change. Strictly speaking, fascism was originally the tactics of the fasci di combattimento. These militant squads of young patriots who helped break the peasant revolt, who took municipal government into their own hands, who banded together for the March on Rome, and who, long after they had been given the government of the nation, continued to break the opposition by means of punitive expeditions, terrorist raids, and political murders. This is from Herbert Wallace Schneider's article on the developments of fascism starting from the Fascistissimo Law, or the Most Fascist Law, in 1927. The Most Fascist Law, surprisingly, was not actually what you would think it would be. I imagine most people on the left, they hear the Most Fascist Law and they think it's a law about taking away transgender healthcare and making it illegal to not be white. No, actually, the Most Fascist Law was a law about labor arbitration. Effectively, what the Most Fascist Law did was organize employers and employees into distinct associations, which would advance their interests against one another under a state-organized labor arbitration system. It effectively socialized what is called the econo-juridical system for the purpose of not only national economic development, but also giving the class struggle a higher significance. That is, bringing it to the level of juridical institutions. The Integral Syndicalists by Edmondo Rossoni argued for an integral syndicalism. They had in mind joint associations that would include both workers and bourgeois. The goal here was to level class distinctions and socialize the economy by means of fusing the two classes so that the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are no longer distinct from each other. Basically, a capable bourgeois would become an industrial manager, while proletarians would increasingly take up more administrative roles and also be promoted from wage earners to profit sharers. The Sorelians actually argued against this idea, because they saw it as a pacification of the class struggle. What is necessary to understand is that the class collaborationism of fascism is not actually an eternal absolute principle. It was simply a practical means of achieving economic development. So make no mistake, a fascist at that time was a radical syndicalist socialist. However, they correctly understood that a total and absolute victory for socialism in conditions of semi-feudal poverty would be a fucking disaster. Perhaps some might want to say that the right is reactionary and the left is revolutionary. Nothing could be more absurd. Fascism, which sits on the right, although in fact we could be placed at the top of the center, is reactionary towards socialism, which, even if it sits on the left, is today typically bourgeois, one might even say conservative and reactionary. But fascism, which sits on the right and is reactionary towards socialism, is on the other hand revolutionary towards liberalism and the liberal state. Since fascism wants to reduce the state to its necessary functions, wants to revive its hierarchies, and at the same time denies the methods of liberal government. It is the language adopted by the PNF after the turn to the right that rightoids use to say that fascism is a right-wing reactionary movement that only adopted parts of syndicalism to realize some kind of pre-1789 guild economy. To believe this, you have to have no understanding of serious Marxism and the thought of syndicalism in that age. Pay attention closely to what Mussolini is saying here given the context of Italy's laggard development. He considers the socialists to be bourgeois. He considers them to be conservative and reactionary. This is the same criticism George Sorel levied at the French parliamentary socialists of his day. If you understand Marxist political economy, you understand that a socialist economy, regardless of its form or appearance, requires a high level of industrial development of both agriculture and manufacturing. This is so that social property is able to routinely and mechanically produce surplus to be reinvested into the social economy, whether it be the expansion and improvement of capital or infrastructure for public life. Imagine a parliamentary socialist regime that nationalizes backward agricultural plantations using the horse and plow, with a social manufacturing sector of primitive workhouses of workers just banging on shit with hammers all day. You need private investment to be able to quickly and effectively develop the means of production so that you have mass-scale industry, scientific agriculture that routinely produces surplus crops, light industry that uses things like small motors and electricity, which is to say a sophisticated industrial economy. That is what actual scientific socialism entails. The socialist parliamentary regime that nationalizes the instruments of a semi-feudal backwater is going to be so poor, austere, and backwards that you might as well call it traditionalist Catholic ultramontanist parliamentary feudalism, because that's basically what that would be. Only it would have been built by a party that calls itself socialist. This is why the tactics of all successful socialist countries in the developing world, and Italy was the developing world at this time, resemble the tactics employed by fascism. That is because the syndicalist or mutualist form of socialist construction is able to still use the bourgeoisie where it is needed, while also socializing the economy. Now, with that rant out of the way, back to the development of syndicalism in fascist Italy. But the most significant consequence of these developments is that the corporationist leaders have shifted their tactics, have practically dropped these nominal corporations, and are now concentrating on demanding a corporate parliament and economic representation. The trend in this direction became so strong that Mussolini himself announced 1927 as the corporate year, and even dropped a casual reference to an economic parliament in place of the worn-out one. Mussolini's words have 1,000 echoes, and the slightest mention by him of such a possibility is enough to set the whole scheme on its feet. There was a sudden rush of political job seekers into the syndicates. There now seems to be little doubt on either side, capital or labor, that a corporate parliament will soon be set underway. This revives the proposals made by the Reform Commission, though they will necessarily be thoroughly overhauled. The new parliament will probably take the place of the old. Instead of being merely added to it, there will be only two, instead of three great vertical orders represented. In some way or other, it will be closely linked to the corporations and the Ministry of Corporations. The elections will probably be very indirect, and whether it will mean a genuine economic democracy within each of the two orders is very doubtful. On the other hand, the constitutions of the syndicates and corporations, those of the employers as well as those of labor, are quite democratic. And if these should serve as a model for the new system of representation, as well they may, fascism will indeed have given birth to an air little resembling itself. So, already in 1927, 5 years after the March on Rome, where yes, up until this point, the fascists did utilize laissez-faire liberal capitalist economy for industrialization purposes, the fascists, through their labor arbitration doctrine, were already on the road to developing a syndical congress for the coordination of industry at the level of state legislation by the representation of each occupational and industrial association. It wasn't until 1939 that Mussolini's government was finally able to bring about the Syndical Congress, the Chamber of Fasces and Corporations. Fasces here is basically the Italian word for the French word syndicat, so we can read this as the Chamber of Syndicates and Corporations. The Chamber of Fasces and Corporations was the lower house that replaced Parliament. The upper house was the Grand Council of Fascism. This actually mirrors modern socialist states quite a lot, actually. In some ways more advanced. On paper, the Stato Corporativo was bicameral, but the upper house is just an executive council, not a house. So this Stato Corporativo was a unicameral syndicalist republic. The People's Republic of China, for instance, is unicameral. But just like fascist Italy's Stato Corporativo, it has the standing committee above the National People's Congress. The National People's Congress is also semi-corporatist, by the way, because while it still uses geographical constituencies, the party distinctions are actually distinctions of occupation. Quite fascinating. Anyways, so only 17 years after the revolution, the fascists already socialized the econo-juridical system and built the syndical state. The most fundamental infrastructure, the political and social apparatus for building socialism, was put in place. All that had to be done was to actually develop the heckin' socialism.
Well, actually, that heckin' socialism was never even tried because Mussolini was a heckin' reactionary, imperialist, capitalist, Zionist, anti-trans, homophobic, queerphobic, fatphobic, gay retard-phobic chud.
Article 12 of the Constitution of the Italian Social Republic, officially known as the Manifesto of Verona, reads that in every factory, whether industrial, private, government-controlled, or state-owned, representatives of technicians and workers must collaborate closely, to the point of having direct knowledge of the factory's management, in setting fair wages and in equitably distributing profits between reserve funds, stockholder dividends, and worker profit shares. Article 16 reads that workers automatically become members of the syndicate regulating the category to which they belong, but that this membership must not preclude transfer to another syndicate if all requirements are met. All the trade syndicates are gathered together under the umbrella of a single confederation comprising all workers, technicians, and professionals, but excluding landlords, who are neither managers nor technicians. Very true. This umbrella organization will be named the General Confederation of Labor, Technology, and Arts. Like other workers, employees of state-controlled industries or public services are integrated into syndicates as a function of their category. The imposing complex of social welfare institutions created by the fascist regime over the past 20 years remains intact, consecrated by the 1927 Charter of Labor. Its spirit will inform all future developments. In regards to foreign policy, Article 8 reads, this foreign policy will also strive for the creation of a European community, made up of all those nations that accept the following fundamental principles. Elimination from our continent the century-long British intrigues. B. Abolition of the internal capitalist system and combat against world plutocracies. C. Valorization of Africa's natural resources for the benefit of Europeans as well as natives, with full respect for those peoples, particularly Muslim ones, who have already shaped themselves into civilized nations, such as Egypt. I don't know, man. This Mussolini guy seems like some kind of Pan-African Islamo-Marxist anarchist to me. So yeah, as we can see, the fascist project of syndicalist socialism is the logical continuation of Proudhonian anarchism. That is, the labor republic of progress, science, and law, constructed out of an econo-juridical system of self-governing institutions. That is what anarchism is. It is not the Marxist ultramontanist parliamentary dictatorship of poverty, mediocrity, and arbitrary rule, which is not even really socialist or even Marxist when we take his scientific socialism seriously, despite the attitudes Marx had in his day. Really, the only thing worth taking seriously in Marx is that which the Marxists of the West don't really believe in. That is, the Proudhonian core of Marxism. But I digress. Vive fascismo! Vive syndicalismo! Vive anarchismo! Vive Proudhon! Total tradcath defeat. Total futurist victory. Vive fascismo. Red fascism, black socialism.